Is there any future for Palestine? 1 year after the October 7th attacks, Gaza lies in ruins, Israeli hostages are still being held, and there are no plans for a ceasefire, much less peace, as Israel's war on Gaza expands. What hope for Palestinians to rebuild with destruction so vast and the war ever growing? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. In the year since October 7th, the unsustainability of both Israel's occupation of Palestine and the war against its enemies has become clearer every day. Though a majority of Israelis support Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, many others will say his destruction-focused strategy has left Israel even less secure. Netanyahu has failed to deliver on both stated goals of destroying Hamas and freeing Israeli hostages. And now the region finds itself trapped in a seemingly infinite cycle of violence. Here's a look.
The latest victims of Israel's relentless one-year onslaught on the Gaza Strip. A mosque and a school this time, bombed at 2:30 in the morning while displaced people sheltering there slept. At least 24 Palestinians were killed and just under 100 injured.
They said all the residents of Gaza should go to the safe area in the south, Khan Yunis and elsewhere, but there is no safe area or anything. As you can see, the mosque has been here for 20 years, and the neighborhood has displaced people without links to Hamas.
Many in Gaza have been displaced from their homes or tents multiple times throughout the year, as Israel's army shifted its focus from one area to another. Everybody has lost relatives, all are suffering mental trauma. Gaza's economy has shrunk to less than a sixth of its previous size. 66% of all buildings in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged, and 68% of the permanent crop fields have declined in health.
Gaza is not a war. Gaza had an earthquake, worse than war. We've been through a grinder. Gaza has been through a grinder this year. The destruction we saw, we've never seen in all of history.
And it doesn't just stop at the destruction. Much of the rubble is contaminated with heavy metals and in some cases asbestos. Pipelines, if they exist, carry toxic water. It will leave a deadly legacy that's set to scar Palestinians for generations.
After we are able to stop Israel from bombing Gaza and Lebanon, we are going to face massive epidemics of cancer and birth defects in the population.
And yet, as international condemnation of the Israeli government mounts, there is no sign of progress on a peace deal since the last ceasefire talks broke down in August. Pro-Palestinian rallies have been held across the world at the weekend, while relatives of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza staged their own protest in Tel Aviv.
Why are they still in Gaza a full year later? Because of Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants to stay in power forever, and to do that, he has dragged Israel into eternal, never-ending war.
And that's what many political analysts fear. With Israel's attention now focused on fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, Gaza could be left to rot. A slow-burning assault that may go on for years. And while Israel's Western backers, led by the United States, all call for an end to the Gaza onslaught, they continue supplying weapons to the Israeli war machine. At the weekend, a small crack appeared. France's President Macron calling for a halt to arms shipments and urging Israel to adhere to international and humanitarian law. It was met with a typically angry response from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
All civilized countries should be standing firmly by Israel's side. Yet President Macron and some other Western leaders are now calling for an arms embargo against Israel. Shame on them.
So while Israel expands the scope of its regional war, little thought has been given to plans for Gaza once peace returns. Israeli officials have floated ideas ranging from long-term Israeli troop deployment there to reinstating the Palestinian Authority's control to even re-establishing Jewish settlements in the Strip. None of those options serve the 2 million people desperately trying to survive in Gaza.
So can any sense of peace even return at this point? Or has Israel ensured its own perpetual insecurity through the destruction of Gaza and continuing occupation of Palestinian territories? Well, joining me now to discuss that and more are from Amman, the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister of Jordan, Marwan Muasher. From occupied East Jerusalem, lawyer and former Palestine-Israel peace negotiator Hiba Husseini. And from Brussels, senior consulting fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, Yossi Mekelberg. Thanks all so much for being with me. Hiba, I'll begin with you. Are we at a place in Palestinian, really, and Middle East history that matches or even surpasses the Nakba of 1948? You know, at that time we saw, of course, the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And today we see another condition laying the groundwork for potentially decades of unresolved conflict. Is this another, even greater culmination of a cycle that started in 1948?
I believe so, yes. The 48 years were devastating in terms of the catastrophe and the Nakba implications, creating the refugee problem and the division of historic Palestine, of course. Now we see Gaza totally destroyed, people displaced, disease, famine, death everywhere, orphan children. West Bank is heading in that direction. And of course, the northern, southern Lebanon, northern Israel, occupied Galilee area. The destruction is immense. The political scenario is very unclear. The direction where Israel is taking this whole conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is nowhere in sight. There's no end of occupation of East Jerusalem as well, where I am today. We see the onslaught on Al-Aqsa Mosque, and no clear vision to end this war in the foreseeable future at all.
Okay.
No articulated plan by Israel. Right. No governance, no rule of law.
We'll talk further about Israel's plans, and actually let me put that to Yossi. I mean, has Israel considered at all the consequences for the conditions that Hiba was just describing? Has it considered any real post-war scenario? Or is escalation potentially the only way for Netanyahu? Because negotiating now would mean that he has completely failed over an entire year of warfare and destruction.
I think maybe I can start from where Hiba ended, and the connection between 48 and now is that when you let conflicts fester, unresolved, they eventually blow up, sometimes in even a worse phase of it. So I think that's what we see now. Now, as far as Netanyahu and the Israeli government is concerned, because the way that this war, a year ago started with a terrible atrocity by Hamas, there was no plan to begin with because Israel was caught by surprise. The trauma was immense. And instead of taking time and thinking about a proportionate response, one that actually can achieve anything political and target only the perpetrators of what happened in October 7, there was the notion that everyone in Gaza is implicit in what happened. And as a result of it, the use of disproportionate force was completely acceptable. And a year later, when we look what Israel set to achieve for itself, eliminating Hamas, bringing the hostages back, but also ensure that Gaza is not a threat, you can see this achievement. There are still hostages there, and Hamas is still standing. And if you speak to any Palestinian, will tell you whether we like it or not, Hamas is part of the political landscape in Palestine. Right now, Israel is using force. It does the same in Lebanon. We would in the West Bank. We expect to see it in the coming days also towards Iran. But it goes back to your question: is there a strategy? At one point, it can translate using military force and military superiority into a peace process, into diplomatic negotiation that will de-escalate, and we can't see that.
Right. Yossi, let me stick with you for a minute, because in Israel, how do Israelis continue to support, so enthusiastically actually, what Netanyahu is doing when there seems to be no strategy, and he hasn't even been able to bring home at least the Israeli hostages after 365 days?
I think it's divided the answer between two. There is no support in Netanyahu himself, and we see it in opinion polls, though he is improving position in recent months. But there is support in the war, and I think it has a lot to do with the nature of what happened on 7th of October. Sadly, many Israelis lost empathy towards Palestinians and definitely the people in Gaza. And this is something will take a long time to recover. They don't make the differentiation between Hamas or Islamic Jihad and ordinary Palestinians, ordinary people in Gaza that have nothing to do with what happened then. Right. So this is it's a combination of fear. I think to add to this, the attack by Hezbollah of the north that displaced 60,000, and because Israel seems to be in the in the war in Lebanon, gives some credibility to what Netanyahu is doing at the moment.
Okay. Marwan Muasher, we have to ask where all of this, for example, leaves Jordan. For many reasons. I mean, if we talk about 1948, it was Jordan that absorbed so many of the Palestinian refugees from decades back. Now we have Jordan being almost the only Arab partner who still has any relationship with Israel. At least the border remains open. But again, where does that leave the relationship with Jordan and the 1994 Jordan-Israel peace treaty? Can it be maintained?
Andrea, the Israeli strategy seems to be clear. The Israeli coalition today does not want a Palestinian state and does not want to end the occupation, and they have, clearly said that. In fact, Mr. Netanyahu said 2 months ago that the Palestinian state is a reward for terrorism. They also do not want a Palestinian majority in areas they control, because today the number of Palestinians is greater than the number of Israelis in areas under Israel's control. And so Jordan fears that if Israel does not want a Palestinian state or a Palestinian majority, that what it really wants is mass transfer. And after what happened in Gaza, Jordan is very worried that conditions might arise or be created that would result in a large number of Palestinians going into Jordan and thereby emptying Palestinian territories of its citizens. That's one issue. The other issue is Jordan, in justifying the peace treaty to its citizens, always maintained that the peace treaty defined Jordan's border, buried the Jordan is Palestine slogan that was then promoted by people on the fringe in the Israeli political system. Mm-hmm. Today, Jordan is afraid that these people are no longer on the fringe. They are, in the center of decision-making in Israel, people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And therefore, Jordan is very worried today that its argument to its own people of why it signed a peace treaty with Israel is today extremely weakened. If Israel does not want a Palestinian state, which was one of the principal aims why Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel, in order to not just, promote Palestinian interests, but Jordanian interests as well. If Israel indeed today is against a Palestinian state, then the justification for the peace treaty with Israel has been severely weakened.
Right. And I mean, where would that leave the region? I mean, for Netanyahu especially, the Abraham Accords, having reconciled a relationship with Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, was a major achievement and proof that, to him at least, that he had the right vision for Israel's future. That is not only lost, but if many are saying the Jordan peace treaty is no longer worth the paper it's written on, Where does that leave the region in relation to Israel? It's completely cordoned off.
What Netanyahu has succeeded in doing is to radicalize Arab public opinion, in addition to radicalizing Israeli public opinion. Today, 65% of Palestinians think that the only way to end the occupation is through armed resistance. Support for the peace treaty in Jordan is in single digits at best. This is the problem with what is happening in Gaza and Lebanon today. Not only that there is so much widespread destruction, but that there is no hope for the future. In 1973, the October 73 war led to peace between Egypt and Israel. The 1991 First Gulf War led to the Madrid peace process. Today, there is no party, not the United States, certainly not Israel, who are willing to put forward a true and serious political initiative to deal with the core cause, which of course is the occupation. And unless the occupation ends, there is very little hope for the immediate future. Okay. This is why the situation is really grim.
Yossi, I have to come back to you because it seems Israel has no intention whatsoever of not only not ending the occupation, but one of the intentions going forward is potentially to put settlers back into Gaza and increase the settlements in the West Bank, therefore further alienating any relationships it had with players in the Arab world. Can Israel afford to have absolutely no allies in the Arab world, including potentially with Jordan?
Again, it's counterintuitive what Israel should do. And Israel, before October 7, was within the region in its best position. Peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, normalization of relation with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, and talks about normalization with Saudi Arabia, all what actually Israel for many, many years dreamt about. And what happens now? Again, I don't know if anyone with the right state of mind in Israel really think that rebuilding settlements in Gaza is the right thing. I hope this is, going to fade away, this kind of talk. 20 years ago, Israel withdrew from Gaza, but definitely we'll see what happened in the West Bank, expansion of settlement, settler violence, settler terrorism in the West Bank. This got to stop. But when you mention allies in the region, but also outside the region, they need to send a clear message. They are committed to Israeli security. They're committed to the well-being of Israel, but not if it behaves this way. This should be a different approach altogether that will lead to a two-state solution, to end the occupation, remove as many settlements as possible, and definitely not talking about the reoccupation of Gaza.
Right. Hiba, let me come back to you, because if we talk about any prospects for actual peace, or at the very least a ceasefire, we have the United States calling for a ceasefire while continuing to supply weapons to Israel. But perhaps on the upside, we suddenly had President Macron of France saying to stop selling weapons to Israel. Do you find that sincere? Is that a breakthrough at all in the role of the international community here to move toward stopping Israel from its assault?
I think, statements are good, but they're not enough. And we've heard statements since 1967 and onwards, and since 1993. And so far, the situation has gotten worse and worse, especially with the role that the U.S. is playing. I mean, I agree with Marwan and Yossi in that the U.S. is giving carte blanche to Israel with the support, military support, financial support, diplomatic support, and the veto at the UN. So I think whatever France, with good intention, means, or other European international members of the international community mean, they cannot deliver. If Israel is not listening and respecting any international laws, or the U.S. position is not very clear and firm, and leveraged enough to stop this war, I don't think we can move in any meaningful way towards ending the ceasefire, releasing the hostages, de-escalating, and yet getting to the stage of the day after in Gaza, especially as Yossi was saying, I mean, Israel wants to reoccupy Gaza. Already they're splitting it into two halves. And they're escalating the airstrikes on Gaza. The displacement of Palestinians to Jordan is very, very realistic. It's not far-fetched. So I think we are farther away from achieving any meaningful peace, especially when also the Israeli government and Mr. Netanyahu is weakening the Palestinian Authority and refuses to have the PA returning to Gaza, assuming any role in Gaza. And the talk about an international force, international trusteeship, Arab boots on the ground, I mean, all of this is unrealistic. So there is no strategic vision, nor is there any decision in Israel, nor is it supported even by the US and other members of the international community to get to a ceasefire. We don't see that happening in the foreseeable weeks.
So, Marwan, none of this is sustainable, as we said, and every day it just becomes clearer that there is no normal to return to. A completely illegal occupation was somehow accepted as the status quo. Israel's allies continue to say, to a great extent, that Israel is only acting in self-defense. So going forward then, does this only force players like Jordan to have to what? Get involved somehow, not necessarily militarily, but then taking in more Palestinian refugees, for example, if this war continues to expand with no end?
Jordan has made it clear it will not do that, because all that does is to empty Palestinian land from Palestinians, and that would aid the Israeli project. So Jordan is not going to do that. I'm afraid, Andrea, that in the short term, there is no political horizon, that people will continue to suffer on both sides. And I hate to be that pessimistic in the short run, but this is where we are heading. I'm more optimistic in the medium and long term because of two factors that are now becoming, that are becoming a factor in the conflict so far. The one is demography. Today, as I said, the number of Palestinians is greater than the number of Israelis. And if there is no two-state solution, it is going to be very difficult for Israel to be a minority ruling over a majority in what is basically an apartheid system. I don't think that the international community 10, 15, 20 years down the road is going to accept such a system indefinitely. The other positive factor is the generational gap that we are witnessing around the world. The younger you are in age, the more likely you are to support Palestinian rights. Not because necessarily you know much about the conflict, but because the issue of rights is now central to this new generation. The combination of demography and the generation gap gives me hope that in the future, both communities will seek solutions that are rights-based. But I'm afraid we are not going to see this in the short term. And that places countries like Jordan in a very difficult spot. There is no way, in my view, that Jordan can go back to the relationship that it had with Israel before October 7th. People will not accept it. If you see people in Jordan and across the Arab world, they are very angry. They do not support a peace process that seems to be open-ended with no end in sight.
But this is what's so interesting. Yossi, I can put this to you. I mean, are the demographics and the youth population, in a way, a light at the end of the tunnel that Marwan was describing, or is that actually a curse for the region because that youth has now experienced such trauma? It could be logical that they go further to seek some kind of revenge, as we've seen in this endless cycle of violence already. Where do you see it? Is there hope, in your opinion, or is it the opposite extent?
I think we can't have the privilege of losing hope. We should, assess the situation in a realistic way, but come up with constructive solution to that. First and foremost, I think there should be change of discourse within both societies, but definitely in the Israeli society. I think the first things that should happen is to end the Netanyahu era. I think he serves as a bottleneck in Israeli politics. It's closely connected to his corruption trial. That's why he legitimized the far right. As long as the far right is actually calling the shots within the government, nothing good can come out of this government. And yeah, raising the demographic issue, and Israel needs to decide whether it wants to be Jewish or democratic, or if it wants to say both Jewish and democratic, it has to end the occupation. It doesn't work both ways, that it can maintain the occupation of millions of people that demographically are growing much faster. It means that it either need to decide to give to everyone the same rights, and it eventually won't be Jewish, or the other way around. So this is a decision. It's a big decision for Israelis, but it needs new leadership. There is really a vacuum of leadership in Israel, which is difficult to see where it's going to
hope the damage that leadership has done can, in part at least, be undone. Yossi, unfortunately, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.